Veterinarians use laser therapy on wounds all of the time. Surgical incisions, open wounds, chronic wounds, orthopedic patients after surgery, and the explanation usually sounds pretty straightforward. Laser therapy decreases inflammation, it should increase blood flow, it stimulates mitochondria, and fibroblasts produce more collagen, and so therefore the wounds heal faster. Except there's a problem. When researchers have actually tested whether laser makes wounds heal faster in dogs, some of the best studies that we have found absolutely no benefit. And then other studies found that maybe it does work. Even more interesting, at certain doses, laser exposure may actually inhibit some of the cellular behaviors that are required for appropriate wound healing. So, does laser therapy work? I think that we're asking the wrong question. So, first of all, what are we actually talking about? Well, laser stands for light amplification by the stimulated emission of radiation. The idea is that light at specific wavelengths will penetrate tissue and is absorbed by cellular chromophores. One of the proposed major targets is cytochrome C oxidase, which is inside the mitochondria. And in theory, that should influence ATP production and reactive oxygen species and nitric oxide signaling and gene transcription and inflammation and cell proliferation and potentially tissue repair. Biologically, this is absolutely plausible. But here's the problem. Photobiomodulation isn't one treatment. The effect depends on wavelength and power and energy density and treatment duration and pulse characteristics and frequency of treatment, tissue depth, pigmentation of the skin, hair coat, and probably the stage of wound healing. So asking, does laser help wounds, may be a little like asking, do drugs help wounds? Okay, which drug, at what dose, and for which wound? Here's the study that should make everybody pay attention. In 2015, Kurash and colleagues published a controlled study in veterinary surgery. They created standardized full-thickness skin wounds in 10 beagles. One wound received low-level laser therapy, the other served as a control. Now, the laser protocol that was used was 635 nanometers at about 1.1 joules per square centimeter 3 times per week. And the researchers measured the things that we actually care about: wound contraction, epithelialization, gross wound appearance, granulation tissue, and histologic healing. What happened? Basically nothing. Laser-treated wounds did not heal significantly faster, they didn't contract faster, they didn't epithelialize faster. Histologically, they didn't look any different. So one of the cleaner experimental canine wound healing studies essentially says, with this protocol that we used, laser therapy didn't improve wound healing on any level. And then another study came out and found the same thing. A few years later, Gammill and colleagues looked at both surgically created open wounds and primarily closed surgical incisions in dogs. Again, the investigators compared laser-treated wounds with controls. Once again, they didn't find a clinically meaningful improvement in healing at all. Now, their conclusion was particularly important because it addressed something that many veterinary practices do routinely. They laser an uncomplicated surgical incision immediately after surgery. Now, their findings did not support routinely using the laser protocol simply to accelerate healing of small, uncomplicated wounds or incisions. And at this point, you could reasonably say, all right, maybe lasers don't work. Except then things get complicated, because other canine studies say that maybe it does work. Now, Wardlaw and colleagues studied dachshunds undergoing hemilaminectomy. These dogs received photobiomodulation over their surgical incisions daily for 7 days. Now, that protocol was completely different. 850 nanometers, 8 joules per square centimeter, and this time the laser-treated dogs had improved incision healing scores. So they took photographs of the wounds, and those were evaluated using a standardized scar scale. By day 7, the treated incisions looked better, and the improvement persisted later in the healing phase. So now we have a canine study saying laser does nothing, and one saying laser seems to improve wound healing. So who's right? Maybe all of them. Now, chronic wounds are a different story. One of the most interesting clinical studies looked at dogs with chronic wounds, and this distinction matters because a perfectly healthy surgical incision and a chronic non-healing wound are biologically very different environments. Now, researchers divided dogs into groups receiving conventional wound care or photobiomodulation using different wavelengths. Now, by about 2 weeks, that laser-treated group had greater reduction in wound area than the control dogs. One of the photobiomodulation groups showed roughly 60% or less reduction in wound care, and the other was around 62%, and the control group was closer to 42%. Now, that doesn't prove that every chronic wound should be lasered, but it raises an interesting possibility. Maybe photobiomodulation has relatively little room to improve a healthy incision that is already healing normally, while having a much larger effect in tissue where healing has stalled. And now we get to the part that I find most interesting. Researchers have also studied laser exposure directly on canine keratinocytes. Now, keratinocytes are critical for epithelialization of wounds. They migrate across the wound surface and they help restore that epidermal barrier. Now, at relatively low laser energy densities, researchers found that increased cellular migration and proliferation occurs, which sounds great. But when the dose was increased to closer to 10 joules per square centimeter, cell migration and proliferation decreased, actually was inhibited. So think about that. The same basic therapy could potentially stimulate wound healing cells at one dose, but suppress them at another dose. That's called biphasic dose response, and it's one of the most important concepts in photobiomodulation. More energy does not necessarily mean more healing. There may be a therapeutic window. Below it, not enough stimulation. Inside it, potential biological benefit. Above it, you may lose the benefit or potentially inhibit the response that you're actually trying to create. Now, this may explain why the literature looks pretty messy. Look at the protocols. One study is using roughly 635 nanometers at 1 joule per square centimeter. Another is using 850 nanometers at 8 joules per square centimeter. Another uses 830 nanometers. And another simultaneously uses 680, 875, and 905 nanometers. Some treatments are performed daily, others several times per week, and some wounds are acute and chronic, and some are open, and others are primarily closed. Some patients have shaved skin, others have fur, and fur itself matters because studies in dogs have shown that coat length and pigmentation can dramatically affect how much laser energy actually reaches the deeper tissue. So saying we did a study of laser therapy doesn't necessarily tell me very much. I need to know the wavelength, the dose, the power, the frequency, the tissue that was used, how deep it is, and what type of wound we're dealing with. So does laser help heal wounds? Here's where I think the evidence currently leaves us. Photobiomodulation clearly has biological effects, and there's enough experimental evidence to take the mechanism seriously. There are canine studies showing improved wound healing outcomes under particular circumstances, but we do not have strong evidence that routine lasering every uncomplicated surgical incision dogs makes it heal faster. In fact, some of the better controlled canine studies specifically failed to demonstrate any benefit at all. What about for chronic or impaired wounds? That evidence becomes a little more interesting to me and potentially more promising. But we still don't have a universally established canine wound healing protocol telling us exactly what wavelength, what dose, what interval, and treatment duration should be used for every single wound. So here's the real controversy. I don't think the conclusion should be laser therapy doesn't work, and I don't think that it should be laser therapy makes wounds heal faster. Both statements are too simplistic. The more scientifically defensible conclusion is photobiomodulation can influence wound biology, but whether that translates into faster clinical healing really appears to depend heavily on the treatment parameters and the type of the wound that's being treated. And until those parameters are standardized, two veterinarians can both say they're using laser therapy while biologically delivering two completely different treatments, which brings us to the uncomfortable question. If you're lasering surgical incisions because you've been told it accelerates healing, do you actually know the dose that you're delivering? And more importantly, do you have evidence that your particular dose actually works? Because when it comes to photobiomodulation and wound healing, the dose may not just influence how well it works, it actually may determine whether it works at all. Follow me for more evidence-based veterinary medicine.